autofocus is a professional feature you should be using on your shoots. However, you shouldn't be using it all the time. There are two parts to this video. First, the reasons why you should and shouldn't use autofocus, and then the second part, the scenarios where autofocus is better and scenarios where manual focus is better. So make sure you stay through to the end of the video because one or two of them might surprise you. If it's absolutely key that you get critical focus, then I think autofocus is the way to go for most people. It guarantees that you're going to get an in-focus shot. Any scenario where it's a very clear image of the person's face and you really want critical focus on them, then autofocus is the way to go. The technology has improved so much, and most brands now, you're going to get a really great result. The second reason is if you are a one-man crew or a small team, or even on your own shooting something like this. When you're in that situation, you have many things you need to be worrying about. You're worrying about the lighting, you're worrying about the sound, you're worrying about the composition of the frame, and you really shouldn't be worrying about focus as well. The third reason to use autofocus is if you have a very fast turnaround. If you don't have the time to redo takes or to double check that your focus is critical and correct, it just makes sense to make sure that you use a feature on the camera that can get you a reliable end result quickly. It might not give you the creativity that you were looking for, but I think in a fast turnaround situation, that might not be the major concern. However, there are times that you should definitely consider using manual focus. First up is actually in a situation where the autofocus may get confused or just can't cling on to the person that you're trying to actually shoot. This is often the case if you're shooting somewhere there's lots of people in frame, there's lots of faces. The cameras can get confused or they might just select the wrong person or jump between different people. Another scenario you might have is if something is going across the frame in front of the subject that you're focused on. The camera's probably going to try and focus on that in between. Now, certain cameras have features to help avoid that, such as the Canon C70, like I'm shooting now, has the ability to just focus on faces, and as soon as it doesn't see a face, it doesn't change the focus. So that's really handy. However, there are still scenarios where it still may get confused. Second is if you have the budget and the access to crew and cinema lenses. If you do, then why not shoot manual focus? And you can have much more creativity and you can actually pick and choose where the focus point is, and it can be there for creative reasons rather than just critical focus. Finally, like I just mentioned before, there are creative reasons why you may want to go with manual focus and as well. Although often we do want our main subject to be perfectly in focus, there are times actually where creatively we want to go a bit in and out of focus. This is a technique I use a lot on my lifestyle type shoots with resorts, where you don't really want that kind of robotic critical focus all the time. In a commercial shoot, your focus point may actually be a creative choice. So those are the reasons, but when would you actually use autofocus and manual focus? Interviews, I think, are a situation where you very much want to use autofocus most of the time. It means that you get a guaranteed critical focus on the person's eye, which is generally what you want when you're doing an interview with someone. I'd argue for most people who are watching this video, you're going to be doing films where actually you want to make sure you have critical focus in an interview situation. And I'd probably guess that most people watching this don't have big crews to work with either. So just rely and trust the autofocus. Use it because it's a big advantage for you as a filmmaker. Secondly is when on a gimbal and shooting people. Your distances are going to constantly be changing between you and the subject, especially if you're doing anything dynamic or anything on a slightly longer lens. Keeping focus would be extremely difficult even if you had a focus puller. Third up is B-roll of people, whether that's corporate or weddings. It's just great to have focus on the person and not worrying about whether or not you've quite nailed it. Often in those situations, you don't have time to make sure that you've actually got the distance correct, that you have got critical focus when you're shooting manually. I also use autofocus on product shots if I'm using a camera that's got really good tracking. The Sony FX3 has awesome tracking for this sort of situation. It really does lock on, it's like glue. However, there are situations where you wouldn't want to necessarily use it, and I'll explain those in a moment. The fifth reason to use autofocus, and this sort of links to 3 and 4 as well, is if you're using a small screen or you're doing very much run and gun shooting. As I mentioned before, it's very difficult to guarantee that you've got the perfect focus when just looking at a viewfinder or a small screen while you're running and gunning. Maybe if you've got plenty of time, you're on a tripod, the subject isn't moving, then yeah, you can punch in, check focus, and make sure it looks perfect. However, if you're running around very quickly, then it's very challenging to get that and achieve that all the time. So autofocus shouldn't be used all the time, and these are the scenarios where I would say actually going manual is a better option. First up is B-roll details, and then this is the opposite of what I sort of mentioned before when it came to product shoots. What I mean by this is if you're just getting, say, shots of items on a table. So often when we're doing hotels and resorts, very similar to real estate videos, maybe you're capturing just different elements of details of a room just to bring together so you can use it in the final film, just as filler effectively. And in those scenarios, actually, I often shoot manual because actually I don't want the autofocus to start tracking or picking something in the frame that perhaps I don't want it to actually follow or look at. The second reason, if there's lots of people in shot. As I mentioned before, sometimes cameras can get very confused about what they should be focusing on. In that scenario, it's probably better to switch to manual instead. Third up is if you want to dirty up the frame. A bit like with lots of people in the shot, if you've got lots of things going on the frame, perhaps you want a bit of foreground blur, things like that, the autofocus may struggle. If you want to achieve cinematic focus pulls, then manual focus is the way to go. It's the only way really you're going to get that really nice looking focus pull from one thing to another. You just can't really achieve that with autofocus. If you've got a locked off wide shot, perhaps maybe at the back of a stage, or maybe you're doing a time lapse, then you should definitely stick to manual focus only. The autofocus may latch onto something that you didn't expect. It may end up switching, it may even go completely out of focus because of lights moving or something moving within the frame, and that could completely ruin your shot. That's even more important when it comes to time lapses, where you don't want any of your camera settings, including your focus, to change during the time lapse. Finally, and the shot that you might be quite surprised at, is if you're doing gimbal shots of interiors. In this scenario, even if I'm using a camera that can do autofocus, I will actually shoot manual. It's because, a bit like with shooting at the back of a room, I don't want my focus to suddenly shift as I'm doing the shot. I want everything in focus. I know I've set my focus point within the frame, and if it suddenly shifts and it gets a bit too close or a bit too wide, I might not notice it while doing my gimbal shot. So actually, I like to set it manually, make sure it looks correct for the distance that I'm doing, and then as I'm doing the shot, I can be confident it's not going to shift at all. So there you go, that are all the reasons and situations. There's no real right or wrong, it's about picking the right tool for the job. Sometimes autofocus will be the right way to go, and other times it's better to go off manual. The best advice I can give you is just to try and learn both. Make sure you really understand how your camera's autofocus works, but also make sure you get out there and practice shooting manually as well. If you've enjoyed this video, then maybe also check out my review of the Sony FX3 and why I think it might be the best compact cinema camera you can buy.